Imagine this. 4,000 years ago, on a small clay tablet, someone carved a story into the surface. It declared that 8 kings had ruled the earth for 241,200 years before a great flood washed everything away. Hard to believe, right? But this is not a legend. It is a real record that still exists today. It is called the Sumerian King List, and it was written on the Weld Blundell prism, now displayed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The artifact was discovered in 1922 in the ancient city of Larsa in southern Iraq, the heart of the Sumerian world, often called the cradle of civilization. Across the surface of the prism, hundreds of cuneiform signs are carved in neat columns. They record the names of cities, dynasties, and the number of years each king reigned. It is not poetry. It is not mythology. It looks like an administrative record, as if a scribe was simply logging data. But within those ordinary numbers lies something that defies all explanation. The first kings were said to have lived for an impossible length of time, so long that history, biology, and reason lose all meaning. Some ruled for 28,000 years, others for 36,000. Altogether, those 8 dynasties lasted more than 240,000 years. And then, the text ends that era with one quiet line, then the flood swept over. That single sentence has haunted scholars for more than a century. Why did the first human civilization, the people who invented writing, mathematics, and law, record something that could not possibly be true? If they were careful record keepers who counted every grain of barley, why would they write about kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years? Some think it was symbolic, a way of marking cosmic ages or mythic time. Others believe it preserved a memory of a forgotten world, an age before history, when humans lived beside the gods they called the Anunnaki. But those are only theories. The prism itself remains silent. It does not explain or argue. It simply records, line after line, as if copying facts that were once self-evident. What is extraordinary is that everything listed in the text is real in archaeology. Cities like Eridu, Bad Tibira, and Shurapak have been found and excavated. Layers of a great flood have also been discovered from the same period. So where does legend end and history begin? That is the mystery we explore tonight. We will not chase myths, but look for the logic hidden in this ancient record. Who wrote it? What did they hope to preserve? And what might it truly mean when it says kingship descended from heaven? If this is your first time here, please like and subscribe so you do not miss our journeys through ancient civilizations and forgotten history. And tell me what you think. If you believe those kings once existed, type the number 1. If you think it is only legend, type the number 2. Now, let us turn back time and return to the land between 2 rivers, where history and the impossible are divided by only a thin layer of clay. In 1922, under the burning sun of southern Iraq, a team of British archaeologists brushed away layers of sand from the ruins of an ancient city once known as Larsa. Among fragments of pottery and broken tablets, one small piece of clay caught their attention. It was a 4-sided object, roughly 8 inches long, shaped like a prism. At first glance it looked ordinary, brown, chipped and silent. But when the dust was gently wiped away and sunlight touched its surface, hundreds of tiny wedge-shaped marks appeared, carved with astonishing precision into neat straight columns. It was not art, and it was not a prayer. It was something else entirely. That small prism would later be called the Weld Blundell prism, named after the collector who donated it to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where it remains today. Experts dated it to around 2100, before Common Era, near the dawn of the Sumerian civilization. Its 4 faces were densely covered with cuneiform script, the oldest written language humanity ever created. Each line followed a strict pattern, listing the name of a king, the city he ruled, and the number of years he reigned. It read like a royal ledger, a list of rulers and dynasties that reached back into a past so deep it bordered on the impossible. What stunned scholars was the first line they translated. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. That sentence was not a poem or a prayer. It was a statement of record. The Sumerians were not simply telling a story. They were documenting the beginning of civilization as they understood it. To them, kingship was not about power or conquest. It was about order, the idea that human society had been given structure and purpose from the heavens. From that moment on, kingship became the thread that connected gods, men, and time itself. The prism's tone was calm and methodical. There were no miracles, no divine battles. It read as if the scribe was recording known facts, steady and clear. That very clarity puzzled archaeologists. How could a people living more than 4,000 years ago, at the edge of written history, have created such a precise system for documenting time and succession? When the prism reached Oxford, scholars began comparing it with other fragments found across Mesopotamia. To their surprise, similar lists appeared in cities like Nippur, Kish, and Ur. Some were shorter, others longer, but they all followed the same order of kings, the same structure, and the same phrase, "when kingship descended from heaven." It became clear that this was not a legend passed down by word of mouth. It was an official chronicle, copied and preserved through generations. One of the first to study it deeply was Thorkild Jacobson of the University of Chicago. He described it as history written through divine chronology, where myth and record were blended into one. For Jacobson, the Sumerians did not separate the realm of gods from the realm of men. Both existed along the same continuum of time. Their kings were not just rulers, they were bridges between heaven and earth. The Sumerian King List, as it came to be known, is often called humanity's first historical document. It is not a prophecy or a sacred hymn, but a list carved into clay, a record that tried to fix memory into matter. What makes it extraordinary is not only what it says, but how it says it. Calm, factual, confident, as if describing events every Sumerian already knew. But the deeper one reads, the stranger it becomes. The first kings ruled not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. 8 rulers before a great flood are said to have reigned a combined total of 241,200 years. To modern minds, it sounds impossible. Yet, archaeology confirms that every city named in the text, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, was real. Each has been excavated. Each left traces of temples, cities, and even floods. The story begins in Eridu, the first city on Earth. Archaeologists believe it was founded around 5,400 before Common Era, near the ancient shoreline of the Persian Gulf. Today, the site is known as Tel Abu Shahrain, a mound of sun-baked earth rising from the desert. Excavations there have revealed 18 layers of temples built one over another, each replacing the last, spanning thousands of years. To the Sumerians, Eridu was more than a city. It was the cradle of civilization, the place where humanity first learned to build, to worship, and to live under law. The king list begins here, with Alulim, the first king when kingship descended from heaven. According to the record, he ruled for 28,800 years. In the Sumerian view, Alulim was not just a man. He was the figure who taught humanity order, the foundation of kingship itself. Under him, people learned to organize, to govern, and to measure time. His successor, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. The text calls him the one who established divine ordinances, suggesting a ruler who united law with sacred ritual. Together, Alulim and Alalgar represent the dawn of human society, the moment when chaos gave way to civilization. When Eridu's time ended, kingship moved to Bad Tibira, the second city on the list. The Sumerians believed kingship was not tied to blood or land. It was passed like a gift from heaven, moving where destiny required. Bad Tibira, meaning fortress of the metalworkers, became a center of early craft and industry. Archaeologists have found evidence of metalworking there, including furnaces and copper tools that mark the first age of metallurgy. The king list names 3 rulers from Bad Tibira. Enmenluana reigned for 43,200 years and was remembered as the one who brought craftsmanship to humankind. His successor, Enmengalana, ruled for 28,800 years and maintained the divine laws of his predecessor. Then came Dumuzid the shepherd, ruling for 36,000 years. Dumuzid is one of the most fascinating figures in the Sumerian world. Later myths describe him as a god of fertility and the cycle of life and death. He was loved by the goddess Inanna, died each year, and returned in spring, symbolizing renewal. In Dumuzid, the human and the divine intertwined. After Bad Tibira, kingship moved to Larak, a city now lost to time. No ruins have been found, but ancient texts often mention its name. The King List gives it one ruler, Ensipad Zidana, who reigned for 28,800 years. His name means the righteous one of faith. Perhaps he ruled a kingdom already fading, a sign of civilization nearing its twilight. Larak's absence remains one of archaeology's great mysteries, a reminder that the earth still holds secrets yet to be uncovered. From Larak, kingship passed to Sippar, the city of the Sunday. It stood north of Babylon and was dedicated to Shamash, the god of truth and justice. Thousands of tablets have been found there, describing trade, astronomy, and law. The King List names Enmendurana as Sippar's ruler, reigning for 21,000 years. Ancient writings say he was taken up to heaven without dying, a phrase that echoes the story of Enoch. In Sippar, kingship became tied to knowledge and cosmic order. Rulers were seen not as conquerors but as keepers of divine truth. Finally, kingship came to Shuruppak, the last city before the flood. Shuruppak, known today as Tel Farah, lies along the lower Euphrates. Beneath its ancient houses, archaeologists discovered a layer of river clay nearly 2 meters thick. It contains silt, shells, and flood debris, dated to around 2900, before Common Era, the very time the King List marks as the end of the First Age. The last ruler before the flood was Ubara Tutu, who reigned for 18,600 years. Tradition calls him the son of Shamash, born between the divine and the mortal. Under his rule, Shuruppak prospered. The city stood beside the Euphrates, its streets lined with mud brick houses, its temples gleaming under the Sunday. Scribes worked in shaded courtyards, priests watched the sky for omens, and the people believed their king was the voice of heaven. But beneath that peace, the river began to rise, and whispers spoke of storms that would never end. The tablets say little, but later legends remember Ubara Tutu as the last of the divine kings, the bridge between gods and men. His son, Ziusudra, would receive a warning from the god Enki to build a great vessel and preserve life from the coming flood. In this way, Ubara Tutu became both the final ruler of the old world and the father of the new. Through him, divine kingship ended, and human history began. Archaeology confirms much of what the Sumerians wrote. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Sippar, and Shuruppak all existed. Their ruins appear in the same sequence given in the text. Each city rose, flourished, and fell, and in Shuruppak, the flood layer remains visible to this day, a silent witness to the event the Sumerians called the sweeping away. Taken together, the 8 kings and their cities form more than a myth. They trace the evolution of civilization itself. From Alulim's laws in Eridu to Enmenluana's craft in Bad Tibira, from Dumuzid's rebirth to Enmendurana's celestial wisdom, each ruler marks a step in humanity's awakening. They built cities, temples, and systems of knowledge, each dynasty adding a new layer of order upon the chaos of the natural world. The Sumerians may have counted their reigns in divine numbers, but beneath those numbers lies a human truth. They were searching for meaning in time, linking their present to a sacred beginning. To them, history was not a list of events. It was a cycle of descent and renewal, of kingship passed like a flame through ages of creation and loss. At the end of the text, after the last king and the last city, the scribe carved a single line. No flourish, no lament, only 4 quiet words that divide myth from history, the old world from the new. Then the flood swept over. If you are still here, please like this video so we know you are still listening. In the next part, we will step through that moment, the Great Flood, and explore why the Sumerians believed that from that point on, the story of humankind began all over again. The last words on the Sumerian King List are brief but final. Then the flood swept over. 4 simple words that ended the age of gods and began the age of men. For a long time, scholars believed this was only a story, a myth used to mark 2 symbolic eras. but the ground beneath the Mesopotamian plain tells the same story in clay. In Shuruppak, the last city named before the flood, archaeologists uncovered a band of river silt nearly 2 meters thick between 2 layers of settlement. Inside it were broken pots, bits of reeds, and traces of life violently swept away. Radiocarbon tests dated that mud to about 2900. Before Common Era, the exact period the King List marks as the end of the divine dynasties. At Ur, Kish, and Lagash, researchers found the same pattern, a layer of clay dividing an older world from a new one. Beneath it stood temples dedicated to gods like Enki and Inanna, half buried and silent. Above it appeared new houses, new streets, and new rulers. The flood was real, not a global one that covered mountains, but a regional disaster that wiped out nearly every Sumerian city at once. It changed not only the land, but how people understood time, power, and themselves. When the survivors rebuilt their world, they also rebuilt their history. The next names on the King List belonged not to demigods but to men, kings who ruled cities we can still find, whose lives left traces in clay. The first was Jushur of Kish. The list credits him with a reign of 1200 years, but that number likely represents continuity rather than literal time, the long process of rebuilding after catastrophe. Kish rose first because it stood on higher ground, spared from the worst of the floodwaters. Archaeological layers there show that soon after 2900, before Common Era, a new form of city-state emerged, with fortified walls, organized workshops, and large public storehouses. This was the beginning of structured government. Under Jushur, power no longer descended from the sky. It was claimed on earth. After him came Etana, the shepherd king, described as the man who ascended to heaven. His legend tells of an eagle carrying him above the clouds to find the plant of birth, a symbol of renewal. Beneath the myth lies something deeply human. Etana represents leadership reborn, the first ruler who unified scattered people into a stable kingdom after the flood. In tablets found later at Kish, his reign is linked to peace, irrigation, and alliances among nearby cities. The Sumerians remembered him not for conquest, but for restoring balance after chaos. Generations later, another name appears in both myth and archaeology, Enmebaragesi of Kish. He is the first king in human history whose existence can be proven by an object. Archaeologists discovered a fragment of a limestone vessel inscribed with his name at Kafaja, dated to around 2700 before Common Era. His rule marks the moment when myth meets record. His inscriptions describe a powerful organized kingdom that traded with neighboring cities and extended its influence toward the Persian Gulf. For the first time, leadership had a physical footprint. Then, from the city of Uruk, came a figure who would bridge legend and history forever, Gilgamesh. The King List names him as the 5th ruler after the flood and gives him a reign of 126 years. No longer eternal, but still greater than life. In the real world, he ruled a thriving city whose ruins still stand today. Archaeological tablets from Uruk and Nippur mention his name alongside that of his father, Lugalbanda, showing that Gilgamesh was not a purely mythical hero. Yet the epic of Gilgamesh turned him into something larger, a man who sought immortality, met the survivor of the flood, and returned home wiser but mortal. Gilgamesh was remembered as both builder and dreamer. He strengthened Uruk's great walls, whose foundations archaeologists have traced to the early dynastic period, around 2700 before Common Era. He represents the final moment when kings still touched the divine but lived fully as men. With him, the mythic age closes, and the historical age begins. The shift from divine to human rule is written not only in the King List but also in the earth itself. Beneath the flood layer, we find temples rebuilt again and again on the same sacred mounds, their records focused on gods and offerings. Above it, we find archives, rows of tablets listing harvests, labour, and trade. Writing, once a gift of the gods, became a human tool to manage cities. Power shifted from heaven to administration, from cosmic order to civic order. Scholar Thorkild Jacobson described this transformation perfectly. "The flood," he said, "marks the transition from mythic kingship to human rule." In those words lies the heart of Sumerian memory. The flood was not only a tragedy, it was a reset. It washed away the divine timeline and forced humanity to begin its own. After the waters receded, the people of Sumer never again spoke of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. Instead, they recorded reigns, events, treaties, and taxes. They built laws, not just temples. They measured time in years, not in cosmic cycles. Civilization did not die in the flood. It was born from it. But behind all that silt and all those temples, one question remains. Why did the Sumerians believe that 8 kings ruled for a total of 241,200 years before the Great Flood? A number too precise to be random, too illogical to be just a myth. What does it hide? An astronomical formula? A political allegory? Or a memory even older than history itself? If you are still here, please like this video to help it reach more people, and stay with us for the next part, where we will decode that mysterious 241,200-year figure, a number that has challenged archaeologists and historians for more than a century. After the flood, the world began anew. Cities rose again from the mud, kings took their thrones, and life slowly returned to the plains of Mesopotamia. Yet among the clay tablets that survived, there remains a mystery that still puzzles historians today. It is not about a battle or a city, but a number, 241,200 years. According to the Sumerian King List, that was the total span of rule for the 8 kings who reigned before the Great Flood. 8 names, 8 dynasties, each ruling for tens of thousands of years. Together, their reigns stretched across an almost unimaginable time. No one truly knows why the Sumerians recorded such a number, but what stands out is that it was not random. Every one of those reigns is perfectly divisible by 3,600, a unit the Sumerians called a sar. In their world, this number was sacred. 1 sar meant a complete cycle of time, both mathematical and cosmic. When the reigns are added together, they amount to exactly 67 sars, equal to 241,200 years. The precision of it has fascinated scholars for more than a century. Why would the Sumerians choose a number so vast yet so exact? What did it mean to them? To understand, we must remember who the Sumerians were. They were not only builders and farmers, but also exceptional mathematicians and skywatchers. They divided the year into months, the day into hours, and built their number system on 60, the same system we still use to measure minutes and degrees. Numbers were not just tools for trade. To them, numbers carried divine meaning. Each one represented balance, harmony, and cosmic rhythm. That is why many scholars believe the answer is not in the lifespan of kings, but in the heavens above. The first interpretation sees the number as astronomical. The Sumerians watched the sky with great care, recording the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. They saw time as a mirror of the heavens. Some researchers think the 67 sars may have represented vast celestial cycles, not human years. One theory links it to Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, whose reappearance each year marked sacred times and seasonal floods. Others believe each sar represented a combined solar and lunar cycle, symbolizing unity between the 2 great forces that ruled heaven and earth. If that is true, then 241,200 years was not meant to measure time, but to express eternal order. It suggested that before the flood, power on earth followed the rhythm of the sky, that the kings ruled in harmony with the universe itself. The second explanation looks not to the stars, but to faith and politics. Scholars like Thorkild Jacobson and Samuel Noah Kramer believe the King List was more than history. It was a declaration of divine legitimacy. When the Sumerians wrote that kingship descended from heaven, they were not describing a physical event. They were saying that power itself came from the gods. The enormous number, 241,200, was not about measurement but about separation. It drew a line between the divine kings before the flood and the human rulers who came after. The number was too large for human imagination, and that was the point. It made the first kings untouchable, eternal, and sacred. The Sumerians believed these rulers lived in an age when God still walked among men. After the flood, kings were no longer divine. They inherited power, but they did so as mortals. In this way, The number became a bridge between worlds. It did not describe history, but belief. Every new king who took the throne in Ur, Kish, or Uruk saw himself as continuing that sacred chain that began in Eridu, the first city, where kingship was said to have been given to humankind. The third interpretation is the most controversial. In the 20th century, researcher Zecharia Sitchin proposed that the gods of Sumer, the Anunnaki, were not mythical beings, but visitors from another planet. According to his view, the word Sar did not mean a sacred unit of time, but an orbital cycle. He said it described the period of a planet called Nibiru, which he believed took 3,600 years to travel once around the Sunday. Following this logic, the 8 pre-flood kings were actually 8 Anunnaki rulers who governed Earth for 67 Sars, or 241,200 years, before leaving. The Great Flood, in his view, marked the end of their rule and the beginning of human civilization. Most scientists reject this idea. No Sumerian text mentions Nibiru, and no evidence of such a planet has ever been found. Yet Sitchin's theory captured the imagination of millions because it blends myth, astronomy, and mystery into one story. And he was right about one thing. The number 3,600 appears again and again in Sumerian records, in trade, in calendars, and in religious texts. That connection between mathematics and meaning is what continues to fascinate people even today. Across all 3 interpretations, one truth remains. The Sumerians did nothing by chance. Every number and every mark they carved into clay was deliberate. Their mathematics was not mere calculation. It was a language of belief. To them, numbers were the voice of the gods. Counting was not just counting. It was a way to connect with the divine. When they wrote 241,200, they were not measuring time as we do. They were expressing something greater, something eternal. Maybe, to them, time itself was sacred. Perhaps they saw years not as a river flowing forward, but as a circle returning to its beginning. Each cycle, each Sar, was a reminder that life, death, and kingship all followed the same divine rhythm. Whatever it meant, that number remains one of the most haunting enigmas ever recorded in clay. It has outlived empires, languages, and beliefs, yet it still whispers of something greater than time itself. Our journey now turns to the Anunnaki, the beings the Sumerians believed shaped both the heavens and the fate of mankind. The Sumerians believed they did not invent civilization, they inherited it. Long before humans learned to rule themselves, they said the world had already been governed by a higher race, the Anunnaki, the children of Anu, god of the sky. Their name meant offspring of heaven, and in Sumerian belief, they were not spirits of imagination but beings of authority who shaped both the heavens and the earth. The Anunnaki established laws, measured time, and set the foundation for order. When they withdrew, they left the structure of their world behind, a pattern for humanity to follow. That pattern survived in a strange artifact of history, the Sumerian King List. Written thousands of years later, it recorded the names of rulers stretching back to an age before the Great Flood. To modern scholars, it looks like a document written by men, but to the Sumerians, it was a continuation of something much older. They believed they were preserving the memory of divine rule, a record first kept by the gods themselves. The King List was not a myth about the heavens. It was an account of the age when the heavens ruled. Ancient texts, such as the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis, describe the Anunnaki as a great assembly, a council of rulers who judged both gods and men. They divided the realms, assigned the winds, and decreed the laws of existence. Their authority was absolute but not cruel. They maintained balance between the divine and mortal worlds, ensuring that the forces of chaos remained bound. To the Sumerians, their legacy was not in temples or weapons but in the systems they left behind, writing, agriculture, kingship, and law. Civilization itself was their gift. When the first cities rose in Mesopotamia, their temples were built as reflections of the divine court. Priests and kings acted as mediators between heaven and earth, continuing what the Anunnaki had begun. The king was not a creator of power but its guardian, chosen to uphold the order first established by the children of Anu. The Sumerians believed that every decision made by their rulers echoed a law written long ago in the sky. This idea, that power comes from above, would outlive Sumer. It reappeared in many forms across the ancient world. In Egypt, the pharaoh was called the son of Ra, ruling through divine light to preserve balance in the universe. In China, the emperor reigned under the mandate of heaven, his right to rule tied to moral harmony. In India, the Devas, the Shining Ones, bestowed Dharma, the sacred law that keeps creation in order. All these beliefs share one origin, the conviction that the right to govern is not born of man but granted from the heavens. The Sumerian King List is the oldest surviving expression of that belief. It does not praise the gods or plead for favor. It records their rule as a scribe would record taxes or land. Each reign, each succession, each city marks the order they left behind. It is not a myth retold but a memory maintained, the administrative record of a divine civilization. Even the form of the artifact reflects that purpose. The prism's 4 sides, carved with perfect lines of cuneiform, resemble a bureaucratic document, not a hymn. It feels like something copied from a much older archive, perhaps the very records once kept by the Anunnaki themselves. Through it, the Sumerians believed they were continuing the work of the gods, keeping history in motion. That is why the King List feels so different from other myths of the ancient world. It has no drama, no emotion, only structure. It reads like minutes from a forgotten government, as if civilization itself were remembering its creators. To the Sumerians, to write was to preserve divine truth, and to rule was to imitate divine order. The King List united both. Thousands of years later, its message remains. It tells us that the Sumerians did not see themselves as inventors of progress, but as heirs to something greater, a cosmic lineage that began before the dawn of history. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Anunnaki, not gods from another world, but the origin of the belief that law, kingship, and civilization itself came from the sky. When the Sumerians etched the first lines onto clay, they probably did not think they were writing history. They were simply trying to do something deeply human, to remember. To remember who ruled, what happened, and perhaps why the world managed to survive each time it fell apart. In that effort, they left humanity a timeless lesson. Every civilization begins with memory and endures through order. The Sumerian King List does not only tell the story of dynasties that lasted for tens of thousands of years. It shows how humanity once understood itself in the cosmos. To survive, we need a common principle, an order to believe in. For the Sumerians, that order came from the heavens. For us today, it may have different names: law, morality, science, or reason. But the meaning remains the same. When we read those ancient texts, we realize that the people of the past were not so different from us. They too wondered why we exist and who created this order. They searched for answers through the earth, through their writing, and through their faith. And thousands of years later, we continue that same journey, only with different tools. Perhaps that is the true value of the Sumerian legacy. It is not found in the number 241,200, or in the names of kings long forgotten, but in humanity's eternal quest to find our place in the order of the world. Because whether we call it the mandate of heaven, cosmic order, or natural law, the idea remains the same. It is the thread that stretches from the Sumerian clay to our own time, reminding us that history is not only what happened, but how humanity has always tried to keep the world meaningful. The Sumerian King List is not fantasy. It is humanity's oldest record of a time when the line between gods and men had not yet been drawn. If this story has given you something to think about, please like this video and leave a simple yes in the comments. In our next videos, we will continue to explore lost civilizations and the mysteries that history has yet to fully tell. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will not miss our next journey. Thank you for staying until the very end. Now, good night, and I will see you in the next story.